Hi, everyone. So what I do is talk about today is inheriting in trust for your beneficiary. So a lot of you in the room probably have a revocable living trust. And when your beneficiaries inherit, they inherit in trusts of their own. I like to call those inheritance trusts because it's easy to understand. So commonly the way this would be set up is mom and dad set up the revocable living trust, and then their children, even their adult children, are going to inherit in trust. And the reason for that, the reason that a lot of parents have their children inherit in trust is because there's a lot of asset protection that comes from inheriting in trust. So for some families, that asset protection might be from what we call bad behaviors or self-destructive behaviors. So if you've got a child who is just a big spender or is not good with money, is unduly influenced by outside actors, and it would be bad to just give them the money to inherit. You can have them inherit in trust. Something a little bit worse, like a drug or alcohol addiction, and giving them the money again would be a bad situation. You could have the trust set up because your beneficiaries are too young to inherit. So in our office, we tend to think anyone under the age of 25 is too young to inherit. So sometimes they'll put the money in trust until they're old enough. And then it goes out of trust, or after a certain age, they can manage it themselves. For people who are disabled and getting certain government benefits, they can't inherit in trust either, or they would get kicked off of those benefits. So that might be a reason they're inheriting in trust. But for a lot of people, they don't have that. They're not worried about, drug or alcohol addiction. If you don't have anybody just getting disability benefits. And so the purpose of that inheritance trust is to protect the money from the outside world. So the big thing that we worry about are divorce. So your son or daughter marries Mr. or Mrs. Raw and they go for a divorce. Most parents don't want to see that soon to be ex in law taking any part of that inheritance. Another problem that could come up is a lawsuit. Unfortunately, it's not hard to get sued in our country. The kids could be just driving down the road, they get a little bit distracted and run a red light and they get sued. If their inheritance from you is in a trust, it's protected. So that's a really nice benefit of the trust. It's also protected from bankruptcy. So, kids have some kind of business venture they go on and it goes south and they have to file for bankruptcy to get out of it. If that money from you is inherited outright, they could lose that as part of the bankruptcy. But if it's inherited from you in a trust, it's going to be protected. So again, there's a lot of really nice benefits to having the kids or whoever your beneficiaries are inherit in a trust. So if you have a flow chart from our office that looks like this, it probably means that your kids are inheriting in a trust. And so this probably is hard to see, but way at the bottom there are blue boxes that say child 1, 2, and 3. That's how you would know if your kids are inheriting in trust. They would have boxes down there. They have those little hash marks over it. That means that they have an inheritance trust. So if you're not sure, if you pull out your flow chart and you have those boxes with your kids' names in it, that's how you would know that they're inheriting in a trust. So there is really just one potential downside to these inheritance trusts. And that's when it comes to taxes and the work that you need to do, or the beneficiaries, your children, would need to do once their inheritance trust is set up. So with these inheritance trusts, the way that they've always been set up, the kids or the beneficiaries do need to get a tax ID number for the trust. The trust is seen as a separate tax entity, and they have to get a tax ID number. Another thing that they need to do then is file a tax return each year for the trust. As far as how the trust is taxed, there's basically two different ways it can be taxed depending on what the beneficiary pulls out of that trust each year. So the most common way that the trust is taxed, and what we typically recommend to beneficiaries when they come in after mom and dad pass away, is that they should pull out all of the trust income each year. The reason for that is if they pull the income out, the individual, the child, is going to get what's called a K-1 tax form. And then that trust is not going to be taxed. The child is going to be taxed. And that's a good result. That's what we want to see, because then that income is taxed at the child's tax rate as opposed to the trust tax rate. So that's how we typically recommend doing it. However, the potential downside with that is that we could lose all of that asset protection that I just talked about on the last slide. The reason for that is because of the new IRA rule. So I think Mark is going to touch on this a little bit. And if you've come in the last 4 years, you've heard us talk about this. But the IRS changed the way that inherited IRAs have to be distributed. Basically, if you inherit an IRA from someone, you have 10 years to get all the money out. And so if you set up this asset protection trust for your children and they now inherit an IRA from you, under option 1 here, they're going to have to pull out all of that money within 10 years, losing that asset protection from divorce, lawsuits, bankruptcy, that sort of thing. So they get the tax benefit, but they lose the asset protection. The second way that trust could be taxed is to not take out the income. So the children, the beneficiaries, are not required to take out the income. They can let the income sit in the trust, and then it keeps the asset protection. But then the downside is that the trust is being taxed at the trust tax rates, which are much higher. So a trust meets the highest income tax bracket of 37% after just $15,000 of income. To contrast that with the individual tax rates, a married couple doesn't reach that 37% tax bracket until they have over $700,000 of income. So the trust tax rates are not as favorable. So with the new Secure Act and the new IRA rules, we've been forced to kind of decide what's more important, the lower tax rates or the asset protection. But there's a potential solution that we've recently learned about that we can start doing for the kids' inheritance trust. And that is called a BDOT. You don't have to remember that, but it stands for Beneficiary Deemed Owner Trust. So the way this works is really the same way for mom and dad. Mom and dad set up the revocable living trust. They have the trust shares for the kids. But when the kids inherit their own trust, it's written just a little bit differently so that in the eyes of the IRS and the tax rules, we are able to say that the kids own just the income of the trust. And that provides us a lot of nice tax advantages. So again, we still want to inherit in trust to protect from all of those bad things, to get the asset protection. But with this new BDOT, we don't have those negative tax implications. So the difference with this new BDOT language is that your beneficiary, again, most likely your children, do not need to get a tax ID number. They use their own Social Security number. They also do not need to file a separate tax return for their trust. Everything is automatically reported under their Social Security number on their tax return. So the big benefit here is that we're going to be in those lower individual tax brackets automatically, instead of worrying about, are we going to be in the higher trust tax bracket? And the really nice thing is, in order to get those lower individual tax brackets, you do not have to take the money out. So when you have that IRA and that IRA has to come out within 10 years, you can actually choose to leave it in the trust and maintain some of the asset protection, rather than taking it all out over 10 years and losing the asset protection. So I'm going to give a couple examples of how this works. The way that the IRS rules and the tax rules work are, of course, complicated. We don't get 100% asset protection in all cases. It depends on how many assets are in the trust and how much income is coming off of those assets. But overall, we do get a better result by using this BDOT trust than if you just use the old language. So in my first example here, I'll just read through it because I know not everyone can see where they're sitting. In my example here, son Billy inherits an IRA worth $400,000 from his mom and $100,000 from her child. So his inheritance trust is a total of $500,000. In the first year after his trust is set up, under the IRS rules, the Secure Act, he's going to take out 10% of the value of that IRA because he has to. So 10% of 400,000 is $40,000. So in that first year, his trust has $40,000 of income. Under the tax rules of that $40,000, $25,000 will be asset protected. So if he leaves all of the money in the trust, 15,000 of it is exposed. If he would go through a divorce, his, ex-wife might be able to get at half of that 15,000, but she doesn't get at the whole trust. She doesn't get at the whole 40,000. She only gets at that small portion. And what would probably be a good idea for Billy is just to take out that 15,000 to use to pay the tax bill or to do something with that little bit of money so that it is not sitting there unprotected. But again, he is not required to take out the whole thing to get the protection. So it actually works out a little bit better if you have more money in the trust. So here I have a second example. So Sally is now inheriting from her mom. Sally is inheriting a $500,000 IRA, and she also inherited a $500,000 Brokerage account. So the total amount Sally is inheriting is $1 million in her trust. So again, under the Secure Act, under the IRS rules, in the first year, she's going to take out 10% of that IRA. IRA is $500,000. She's going to take out $50,000. Now, in this situation, because the trust amount is bigger overall, under the IRS rules, all $50,000 is going to still be asset protected. So she doesn't have to take out any money at all from her trust, and she's still going to be under lower tax rates, and everything is going to be protected. So these trusts can work really well in the right situation. They're not the right type of trust for everyone. So if we are worried about this bad behaviors, spending habits, addiction, things like that, a BDOT is probably not going to be recommended because they actually have access to all of that income. They get that $50,000 to go and spend foolishly if they want it. So if we can't trust the kids to have the access to the income, then these types of trusts probably aren't the right idea. Might not also be right for a young person either, depending on how young they are or how much income the trust is throwing off. It might work out, if they're in college and their tuition is $40,000 a year and their trust throws off $40,000 a year of income, it might work out perfect. We don't know. That's kind of a maybe. But where they really can work out is, again, having adult children, or we're not worried about the bad behaviors or disability. We just want to protect from the outside world. These BDOT trusts are very good for that because they do protect from the divorce, the lawsuits, the bankruptcy, things like that. So if it sounds like this might be something that would work for your family, you've got the adult children who don't have any of the bad behaviors, but you want to make it a little bit easier on them from a tax standpoint, it might be a good idea to look into setting up one of these BDOT trusts. So what would that look like for you? It kind of depends on where your estate plan is right now. So if you have a revocable living trust that was done by our office in the last few years,
we might be able to do what we call a trust amendment to get this new language in there for you. It's just updating one section of your trust for you. If that's the only update you're interested in making, we can actually sometimes just do those over the phone and through the mail. You don't even have to come into our office. If it's been a little while since you've seen us, more than 5-6 years, it might be a good idea to come in and review your whole plan to see if any other updates are needed, and then maybe put this language in as well. If you don't currently have a trust with us, we will be using this language going forward when the situation calls for it. So again, we still have to look at the family situation and make sure that the BDOT makes sense, but that will kind of be your default as long as it makes sense. And then if you have an irrevocable trust that was done by our office, we can update the irrevocable trust. So even though they're irrevocable, there are ways that they can be updated. It's a little bit more complicated, but it can be done. So I would suggest you just call our office and we can talk about that.